Mother Nature, she's gonna get you. Yeah, she's gonna get you. Mother Nature, she's grown to hate you, and she's gonna get you. Gonna get you, you betcha.
Every year of my life, that's almost 52 years so far, the world has become a worse and worse.
Welcome to Nature Bats Last on the Progressive Radio Network. It's NBL on PRN.FM. This April the 7th, 2020 edition, episode 137 of Nature Bats Last, comes to you live from Rakino Island in Aotearoa and also from Central Florida in the United States. This is Kevin Hester, and I'm joined by Professor Guy McPherson. In addition, today we have a special guest. Guy, will you do the honors, please?
Thank you, Kevin. Today we are delighted to have Paul Gunter on this show. Paul is a co-founder of the Clamshell Alliance anti-nuclear group, an energy policy analyst and activist. He has been a vocal critic of nuclear power for more than 30 years. And as a result, he has been arrested at Seabrook Station nuclear power plant for nonviolent civil disobedience on several occasions. Paul worked as the director of the Reactor Watchdog Project for Nuclear Information and Resource Service for almost 20 years. And in 2007, he joined Beyond Nuclear as their nuclear reactor specialist. He has made many national and international television, radio, and conference appearances, and he is often quoted in the press. In 2008, Gunter was awarded the Jane Bagley Lehman Award from the Tides Foundation for outstanding achievements in, quote, the fight against nuclear power. Paul, welcome to Nature Bats Last on the Progressive Radio Network.
Thank you very much.
It's great to have you on the show today, Paul. Thank you for your time. I do have a number of questions for you. My first is, as we stand here today, what is the most pressing issue you see on the nuclear front?
Wow, there are so many, but the list sort of heads up with the aging of nuclear power stations all around the world. Do you understand that this is a 1960s vintage technology where there are very many harsh operational environments in a nuclear power plant, including radiation that can change the character of metal, make it more brittle. There's in tremendous heat, pressure, vibration. These are all acting together and can introduce cracks and corrosion, and that is those are all cumulative effects that eventually wear and tear on safety systems. So there's this struggle that is constantly pitting nuclear utility profit margins against the nuclear industry's safety margins. And more times than not, the production margins are winning out. For example, right now, pressing us today is this COVID-19 pandemic. And that has some very direct effects on nuclear power plant operations. Power plant crews are not immune to the pandemic virus. And yet, nuclear power stations are not passive facilities. They need the constant alert and vigilant operators. But we're already seeing COVID-19 start to take effect on plant operations, and the station operators are falling ill to this very debilitating virus, and it's cutting into the margins of workers who are there on site. What we're seeing is that the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission and other regulatory agencies around the world are compensating or making plans to compensate for a diminishing workforce that falls ill to the pandemic by relaxing enforcement of regulations and licensing agreements. For example, workers are, in order to protect against chronic fatigue, there are technical specifications within all these nuclear power stations that put limits on the amount of overtime that a worker can be in a control room, for example. And within the last few weeks, with the upgrading of this pandemic, we're seeing the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission relax standards so that workers in control rooms are now looking at to be able to operate reactors on 12-hour shifts for 2 weeks at a run. And that is a violation of their operating license agreement to protect against worker fatigue. But because the industry is making plans to be so pressed by this pandemic that they have already gotten blanket exemptions from the safety regulator to relax those fitness for duty requirements. So, and the same is true for, while the Center for Disease Control is recommending social distancing for nuclear power plant workers, just as they are for every other industry or population, we're seeing the Nuclear Regulatory Commission press forward on refueling nuclear power stations, which can bring in 1,000 workers from around the country into communities surrounding nuclear power stations so that they can refuel them for a power agenda. But at the same time, they're relaxing safety margins using the CDC guidance for population distancing so that they can delay safety inspections, delay repairs for as long as 24 months. So we're seeing the industry and the regulator talk out both sides of their mouth with regard to promoting production agendas, protecting profit margins, and at the same time allowing exemptions and not enforcing regulations so that they are eroding away safety margins.
Thank you for that response, Paul. If you're listening live, please call in with questions or comments for Paul and us. Our toll-free number is 888-874-4888 in the States and 011-605-562-5119 elsewhere. These numbers are included at the bottom of my latest post at the Nature Bats Last blog, GuyMcPherson.com. Before we get too far down the road, I'd like to acknowledge Mimi Gurman, sometime guest on this show, providing fodder for my questions, and in some cases, the questions themselves. Paul, let's start with the worst-case scenario, and it seems like we're on that path. And maybe it'll get better from there. What is the worst case scenario? Does it involve, for example, people working 12-hour shifts for 2 weeks at a time? And what else could possibly go wrong? And in your opinion, where are we headed if we pursue the worst case scenario? I mean, I can't even imagine a bus driver, for example, or an airplane pilot, commercial airplane pilot being allowed to work 12-hour shifts for weeks at a time and have that be called safe. And yet here we have systems that impact everybody in the world, and apparently we can have really extended work shifts for a long period of time.
Well, it's really a culmination of relaxation of safety standards and licensing requirements that worries us most right now. Let me just say, first of all, that there are fires burning around the Chernobyl nuclear power station in Ukraine from an accident that occurred there on April 26, 1986, when the Chernobyl nuclear power station, during a routine experimental operation, they exploded a nuclear power station that sent radiation globally. Since 1986, there have been these huge exclusion zones in Ukraine, Belarus, southern Russia, and contamination that still has food restrictions in place all across Europe, and even into the United Kingdom, Turkey, and elsewhere. So the worst case scenario is, in fact, a culmination of these relaxations of standards to protect against worker fatigue, combining the reduction of the protection against component failure by relaxing inspection requirements, and the ongoing aging of nuclear power stations that is causing embrittlement, cracking, corrosion, fatigue. So, what we're watching for is these gathering clouds of a perfect storm, where the pandemic, in this case, could reduce worker populations, create an environment where mistakes combined with mechanical failures can cause a nuclear accident. This is, in fact, what happened at 3 Mile Island here in the United States back on March 28, 1979. There was a mechanical failure at 4 a.m. in the morning when the crew was not at its most alert, and there were worker errors that exacerbated the mechanical failure and caused a partial meltdown of the nuclear power plant there near Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And time again, we see how fatigue and mechanical failure can coincide to cause a number of accidents in nuclear power plants. So, this is what we're now vigilant for. But on top of all of this, the nuclear industry is not only aging and deteriorating in a material condition, but it's failing economically. And so the combination of the loss of its economic viability means that the industry and the regulators are cutting corners to aid the failing economics, but at the cost of cutting corners on safety and security at nuclear power stations. So we're seeing, we have to be vigilant as we see layer upon layer upon layer of adverse conditions. Again, fatigue, material condition, economic failure. These are all piling up now that should a natural event occur during this time, an earthquake, a security event, any one of these can constitute the last straw on the nuclear industry's reliability and causing failure and cascading into an accident like we saw at Fukushima Daiichi on March 11th, 2011, where an earthquake of at a severe level caused an unprecedented tsunami that then wiped out a vulnerable nuclear power station in Fukushima, where they lost the electrical grid from the earthquake. Then a tsunami wiped out the backup emergency power at Fukushima Daiichi, and that resulted in 3 nuclear meltdowns. And those consequences persist today.
I have some very pressing issues that I think that no one's talking about in the Japanese nuclear industry, where after Fukushima Daiichi, all of their nuclear plants were shut down, and whilst they were shut down, they had absolutely minimum amounts of maintenance done on them because, for obvious reasons, with the nuclear industry, money, the same old story. And now, one by one, they're restarting those nuclear power stations in Japan. And there's been a lot of metal fatigue that's taken place with them being shut down. So I think that those time bombs that they're restarting now are more dangerous today than they were before they were shut down. What are your thoughts on that and the metal fatigue component of that?
Well, the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear accidents in 2011, in fact, prompted the Japanese government and the Japanese nuclear regulators to go back and reformulate the way they were regulating. I mean, what Fukushima disclosed was what we commonly refer to as regulatory capture, and that is that the nuclear industry, in fact, runs the nuclear regulator. And here in the United States, for example, 90% of the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission's operating budget comes from licensing fees from the industry to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So, there's just by the licensing fees alone, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission sort of has its hands tied behind its back in that they can't do sweeping actions that might require shutting down all of the U.S. reactors that are like the Fukushima reactors, these General Electric boiling water reactors, because if they shut down reactors with design faults, then they lose much of their operating budget. So there are these built-in controls where the industry can call the shots. And that was certainly the case in Japan. In fact, the Fukushima was built in the early 1970s. And in order to make the cost of building the 6 units at Fukushima Daiichi more affordable, the operator, Tokyo Electric Power Company, lowered the natural tsunami walls around the Fukushima plant. So during the construction, they brought down the grade at which the plant was started by 80 feet. So they lowered the construction site down to 80 feet, and they from the dunes and the land formations, the natural geography around Fukushima, that was removed in order to make it more cost efficient to pump seawater into the cooling systems for Fukushima Daiichi. So they made it more vulnerable, and the regulator cooperated in that they said, and with their probability assessments, they said, we'll never see a tsunami hit Fukushima that's any higher than 13 feet to 15 feet. Well, the tsunami that hit there on March 11th was 50 feet, a 50-foot wall of water that destroyed safety systems and backup power systems there. And it's those kinds of decisions that made the plant, actually all of Japan's nuclear power stations, vulnerable. But regulatory capture is not unique to the Japanese system. And certainly we're increasingly concerned about the same kind of relaxation of regulations around U.S. nuclear power stations that can make them vulnerable to things like earthquakes, flood protection, fire protection, security measures, to address aging, and certainly metal fatigue is one of those areas. And to give you an example about how metal fatigue is a concern today, as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, in order, at the same time, they're allowing these large super crews to come in from all over the country to do refueling operation while the plant is shut down. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission and the industry are going to allow operators like at Indian Point or near New York or at the Comanche Peak in Texas or Turkey Point near Miami to relax inspection of reactor parts like steam generators that undergo extreme heat and pressure as they generate steam from the atomic fissioning process. And these reactors, particularly Comanche Peak, Braidwood in Illinois, and Turkey Point in Florida, they're required during these refueling outages to do inspections of these vital components like steam generators to look for cracks in thousands of tubes that are involved in heat transfer from the reactor to the turbine, and they're required to inspect these steam generators every 48 months. Well, these reactors are now down for refueling, but the utilities are saying, well, we don't want to bring those crews in now for inspection to protect them from COVID exposure. So on the one hand, they're bringing in thousands to do refueling, and on the other hand, they're going to keep them out so that they can expedite bringing these power plants back online without the required inspections and let them operate another 2 years. So these are some concerns where, they're juggling things like inspections and repairs on metal fatigue, and that can cause accidents like what we saw at Fukushima.
Paul, it seems that worker fatigue, metal fatigue, the occasional tsunami, squirrels, balloons, frozen power lines, and floods can cause nuclear power plants to melt down. Can you walk us through the process, starting with whatever your favorite source is? And then I'm pretty sure I know the answer to this question, but I'd like you to answer it. What's the backup plan?
Well, the concern is that, fundamentally, nuclear power is an inherently dangerous technology. There's nothing passively safe about nuclear power. First of all, every nuclear power station around the world requires 100% of its power for all safety systems, as redundant as they are, to get its power from the electrical grid. So the electrical grid is the first and most important safety feature of nuclear power stations. So if for any reason the electrical grid goes down, be it a tornado or a hurricane or a saboteur, or in one case even in the Midwest, as has been pointed out, a squirrel caused an electrical grid failure. The power is automatically shut off to safety systems at nuclear power stations. With the grid failure, the backup is then emergency power systems from emergency diesel generators. It could also be an electrical dam, a hydroelectrical dam next to the nuclear power station. But while the plant is now shut down, it's still a lot like having a cast iron skillet in an oven. Even when you shut down the oven, the cast iron remains extremely hot. And that's the case for nuclear power stations. And that residual heat has to be managed in order to keep the nuclear fuel from melting down. So these emergency diesel generators, for example, will power up to keep cooling, recirculating through these nuclear reactors, and then you're requiring the cooling systems to reliably operate. You're hoping that, for example, the emergency diesel generator fuel tanks aren't flooded, which would introduce water that could choke off power to the emergency diesel generators, and then you're sort of in the same kind of situation that there was at Fukushima, where their emergency diesel generators were flooded by that tsunami. Well, then you have a backup of on-site emergency batteries that, again, are only there to keep safety systems going after the reactors are shut down, to keep cooling going. But with the loss of the grid, you lose safety systems. So priority systems kick in. And with the loss of emergency diesel generators, more safety systems are lost, and even a narrower margin of priority systems are remaining operational to keep the most vital operations for cooling going. But emergency backup batteries are only typically there for 4 to 8 hours. And since Fukushima, some of those systems have been upgraded, but still there are concerns that you can lose all of those backup systems, as was demonstrated at Fukushima Daiichi. Ultimately, your last, what they call defense in depth measure around nuclear power plants is evacuation. Here in this situation, let's just remember that if for some reason a cascade of failure starts, that the evacuation, the last line of defense, doesn't apply around nuclear power stations where large populations are already locked down because of the pandemic. So, we've got a situation now where the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is relaxing its regulations and allowing plants to operate outside of compliance with their operating licenses, knowing that ultimately the evacuation emergency plan isn't going to work during a pandemic.
Paul, I'd like to inject a little bit into that debate, where I've got a high voltage switching and protection qualification from the London Electricity Board. And I've had a lot of experience with complex electrical systems. And in all my decades of being involved in that industry, I never once met an electrical system that didn't fail. And that's where I've always been, anti-nuclear, because of the consequences of having all your eggs in one basket and relying so much on these complex systems. Can we just move on now to another subject that's dear to my heart, and that's anti-nuclear activists, whistleblowers. And one of the inspirations for me in my journey, in my anti-nuclear journey, was Karen Silkwood. I firmly believe that the nuclear industry murdered Karen. What's your take on what happened to her?
Well, we share that concern that Karen Silkwood, who worked for Kerr-McGee in a plutonium processing facility in Cimarron, Oklahoma, was intercepted on her way to talk to the New York Times and deliver documents that we believe would have shown evidence of the illegal and secret transfer of plutonium, smuggling of plutonium, possibly to the Israeli government for the production of the first nuclear weapons there in Israel. And however, Karen's scheduled rendezvous with the New York Times was cut short by a single car crash that later showed signs that her vehicle was driven off the road and into a fatal crash, and that the documents that had been initially spotted by state police who had arrived on the scene were later removed and never made their way into the public realm. But I've known personally, similarly, workers who were involved in whistleblower complaints, who were nearly electrocuted before they could make their claims publicly known while they were on the job that they believed were deliberate acts to shut them up in the most dramatic way. We're staunch advocates of whistleblower protection. These are the ways that, you want to protect the anonymity of whistleblowers, to protect them not only from harm, but harassment and intimidation, so that this, again, inherently dangerous industry can be as transparent as possible, because you want safety to be paramount and not a production agenda that can drive workers to the point of error by fatigue or by mistake, but also allowing, putting workers in a position of where they're supposed to shut up about problems that they see in their line of work that could cause failures in system structures and components, leading to a catastrophic accident.
I think what you're hinting at is the public relations approach. And as nearly as I can tell, the PR approach with nuclear power plants is nearly identical to the public relations approach for President Trump and COVID-19. Apparently, there's no need to change a model that works. Can you walk us through the PR of nuclear power, who benefits, and how can we see through the smoke and mirrors of the public relations industry around nuclear power?
Well, the whole idea of, again, the nuclear industry running the regulatory body, this regulatory capture, is driven primarily by public relations, where initially when the nuclear industry was born in the 1950s, the public relation gimmick at that time was that that nuclear power was the peaceful atom. And in fact, just before President Eisenhower, in his 1953 speech to the United Nations, where he introduced the term the peaceful atom, in 1952, the year before, the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission introduced a white paper that included corporations like Monsanto, Union Carbide, Detroit Edison, Pacific Gas and Electric, Commonwealth Edison, a whole host of U.S. industrialists, power producers, that where the Atomic Energy Commission and the industry agreed that they would collaborate to generate plutonium for nuclear weapons development through the cogeneration of electricity from the excess heat from making nuclear weapons that could then go to make steam and make electricity too cheap to meter. So the original plan was dual-purpose reactors that would first and foremost bolster the nuclear weapons development of plutonium through the fissioning of the atom, and in the byproduct would be cogenerated heat for electricity. That was the initial plan in 1952. By 1953, that transferred into the peaceful atom. Atomic weapons development.
They're as cunning as ditch rats, these people. Hey, can we go back to Fukushima Daiichi for a moment, please? We regularly hear about the 300 tons of irradiated water that's accumulating at the plant every day. But few media outlets mention that 3 coriums have escaped primary and possibly secondary containment and are now exposed to the atmosphere. I don't see anybody talking about the fact that those coriums are emitting ionizing radiation into the air 24/7. What is your thoughts on that?
Well, in fact, our understanding is the cores have essentially disappeared. Nobody really knows where they are. We'll concur that they burned through the reactor pressure vessels and exited out the bottom. It's also likely that they burned through portions, if not through the concrete floors of those containments. But Kevin, they've not been able to get even a robot close to those those molten cores. The robotics have essentially burned out. We have technology has had some inklings that the cores are not where they were supposed to be, but they are right now water pouring off of the mountains behind Fukushima Daiichi are filtering through groundwater into the wreckage site and mixing with the radioactive contaminants there, and are being pumped off into huge tank farms that are growing day by day and running out of space. And this has been true ever since the accident in 2011. There have been some filtration operations to take out radioactive nuclides that have been on again and off again during this time frame. But we've got thousands of tanks that are filled with radioactively contaminated water that the Japanese nuclear industry right now is trying to get permission just to dump into the Pacific Ocean. And the fishing communities around Fukushima Daiichi are stridently opposing those plans, but the government, we believe is still captured by the industry, are still moving towards those essentially unrestricted releases of tremendous amounts of radioactive water from these thousands of tanks back into the ocean. This is going to present these melted cores that are no longer contained are going to present principally sources of contamination for groundwater and cooling water that is constantly needed to circulate over these molten reactor cores to keep them from going critical again. So that's primarily the main source of radiological contamination that's happening now. Frankly, we've not seen tremendous amounts of radioactive off-gassing into the atmosphere post Fukushima. But what we do see is that those initial explosions allowed tremendous releases of radioactivity into the atmosphere that resulted in fallout that blanketed much of eastern Japan that fallout is still in forested areas. It's still some areas have been what they call decontaminated, where they've taken the topsoil off. They've put it into these huge black plastic bags, but then they've just stacked the bags up. There's really no place, even when the contamination is remediated, there's no place for it to go. But even these areas that have been decontaminated by removal of the topsoil are constantly being recontaminated, by runoff from rains and cyclones that wash radioactivity out of these wooded areas, these forested areas, these mountain areas, and then recontaminate areas that have been mitigated. So the government and the inclusion with the industry they're trying to force people that the tens of thousands that were evacuated following the accident, they're trying to force them now back onto these contaminated lands and essentially to say everything's just okay.
We often hear and read that small modular reactors, SMRs, are the greatest thing since sliced bread. That leads to two questions. What was the greatest thing before sliced bread? And are SMRs really as good as we often hear?
Well, I think that we all need to remember that initially the nuclear industry was small modular reactors. They were the design model was small modular reactors. We had these early reactors were less than 100 megawatts, and they because they were so small and didn't produce a lot of power. The argument became that we needed large economy of scale to become more economically efficient. So the small reactors were phased out, and the large reactors, instead of 100 megawatts, for example, they became 1,000 megawatts, 10 times the size of even larger, 1,400 megawatts. So the economy of scale resulted in the revelation that what was too expensive to build at small levels was even more expensive to build at the large level. So fully half of the reactors ordered in the 1960s through the 1979 were resulted in economic failure. And now, they're trying to change, again, the public relations argument that the idea that small is now beautiful again. And however, the change that they're talking about now is to build a huge factory complex to automate the construction of these SMRs on conveyor belts, where they would essentially, at the end of the factory, would roll out a modular reactor that could then be transported directly to the site of operation, and then you put together one control room that could operate 10 or 20 of these small modular reactors. So you still have the concern for huge nuclear facilities where you have 10 or 20 100 megawatt reactors, all operating off the same control room. But it's going to be even more expensive to build these factories. The concern here and the reality is that renewable energy from wind and solar primarily, but coupled with energy efficiency and conservation, this is what the 21st century has developed as the most economically reliable, dependable, safe, and efficient way for new generating capacity. This is what's happening. And they're premising these small modular reactors, these huge factories, to be built when they're not even economically competitive with wind turbines or utility grade solar industries or energy efficiency applications at residential, commercial, and industrial levels. Tesla's Sparks, Nevada factory is now about to roll out in a factory scenario huge amounts of utility-grade batteries that on the order of 250 megawatts per battery that can store solar and wind power for utility operation to, smooth out the intermittency that is argued as the bottleneck for renewables. So this is happening now, and yet the small modular reactor idea is still going to be the most expensive, and it's not going to have the ability to compete with renewable energy.
Thanks very much for that, Paul. We're sort of coming close to the end of the show, and I have one last question that I'd like to run by you. When Fukushima Daiichi melted down and the generators failed to start and the spent fuel pools were getting hot and evaporating the coolant water, the Japanese brought in fire brigades and they pumped salt water into those spent fuel pools to cool them down. And they still tell us that they're going to remove those fuel cells from the fuel assemblies from those pools. Can you describe for me how you would see a spent fuel pool fire igniting and what that would be like? And we'll have to make it quick because we're coming to the end of the show, unfortunately.
Okay, well, thank you so much. But our main concern is for spent fuel, particularly, and let's be clear. It's not spent in any shape or form. It's highly irradiated. So this highly radioactive fuel, irradiated fuel, is when it comes out of the reactor during these refueling operations that are going on right now at 10 reactors around the United States. It comes out extremely thermally hot, and this is when the irradiated fuel is most vulnerable to a loss of coolant accident. If you lose cooling water for these irradiated fuel pools, it can, if it's exposed to the air, it can catch fire, and it will burn like a flare that burns with such intensity. It's called an exothermic reaction, but it burns with such ferocity, like a flare, that if you pour water on it at that point, it will chemically separate out the elemental form of water into hydrogen and oxygen and create a explosive environment. And so you can actually cause a much worse catastrophe when these spent fuel pool fires can then explode with hydrogen and oxygen finding an ignition point. And according to the National Academy of Sciences, these can cause cancers out hundreds of miles.
Yeah, for me, the spent fuel pool fire is my worst case nuclear disaster. Hey, Paul, we're going to have to bring this interview to an end. Thank you so much for your time. I would like to thank our listeners. So you can catch NBL on PRN the first Tuesday of each month at 3 p.m. Eastern. And also you can continue to follow the Nature Bats last blog, guymcpherson.com, for further updates, interviews and speaking tours. And you can keep current with my work at kevinhester.live. Thanks again to today's guest, Paul Gunter, our listeners, and to AfroZen for his music. Guy?
Thanks, everybody, for listening. Thanks to Paul. We appreciate your presence very much. Thanks again to our listeners. Remember, the dominant culture can be very clever, but in the end, nature bats last.